Watergate, the most significant scandal in American political history. Maybe you've heard of it before, maybe you haven't. Nevertheless, it reshaped American politics and how Americans view their government. The scandal is so influential that we name any pop culture scandal after it. For example, Deflategate with the New England Patriots. The suffix of gate implies a scandal of great impact, and it's all because of Watergate and the impact it still has on our society today. So what was the Watergate scandal? Simply put, in 1972, President Richard Nixon committed several felonies while in office by authorizing the burglary of the offices of his Democratic opponents during the 1972 presidential election. He committed several more by bribing those involved to keep them from implicating his role in the crime, and by misleading investigators and destroying evidence that would have proved his guilt. The scandal would force Nixon to become the first and only president to resign from office, and it caused the American people to deeply distrust their government and those who ran it. This distrust still exists today, whether warranted or not, and sometimes manifests itself in conspiracy theories and outlandish claims that are never proven.
So how did Watergate happen? June 17, 1972. 5 masked men break into the Democratic Party offices at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and are caught by a security guard. The burglars are arrested and taken into custody. The burglars had photographed documents that outlined the Democrats' strategy to beat Nixon and win the election, and they had planned to wiretap the phones in the office. The Nixon campaign planned to use this information to stay a step ahead of the Democrats and win the election themselves. Nothing seemed unusual about the crime until the press discovered that one of the accused burglars, James McCord, was the coordinator of a group called the Committee to Re-elect the President. This directly implicated that the Nixon campaign was responsible for committing the crimes for the purpose of cheating in the election, and that perhaps the president himself was involved.
Privately, Nixon began to panic and became obsessed with covering up his involvement in the crime. Nixon ordered all incriminating papers destroyed at the White House offices, and he asked the CIA to urge the FBI to stop the investigation into the burglaries because it endangered national security. The FBI, of course, refused this request. And a few months later, the Committee to Re-elect the President paid the burglars almost $500,000 in hush money to keep them from talking to the FBI and possibly implicating the president and his inner circle of advisors in the crime.
Initially, the public cared very little for the scandal. The Nixon administration continued to deny any involvement, and as Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, he continued to brush off the scandal as nothing more than a salacious rumor and ridiculous conspiracy.
That's just plain poppycock. We're going to stay on this job till we get the job done. And let others wallow in Watergate. We're going to do our job.
The strategy worked, and Richard Nixon easily defeated George McGovern and was re-elected in one of the biggest landslides in presidential history. However, as 1973 started, the scandal surrounding Nixon and the Watergate break-in began to heat up. A secret unnamed source inside the White House began leaking information to the Washington Post that connected members of the Nixon administration to the burglary. 2 reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, persistently published articles using information provided by their source inside the White House, and the public began to demand answers from Nixon. The scandal reached a fever pitch when James McCord went on trial. McCord was the former coordinator of the Committee to Re-elect the President, who was arrested in the burglary. McCord notified the court that he had lied under oath to protect the president, and provided statements in the court that suggested that members of the Nixon administration were involved in the burglary, even at its highest level.
Nixon began to go into damage control, desperate to keep control of the situation. April 30th, 1973. Nixon fires his White House counsel, John Dean, and announces the resignation of his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, and Chief Domestic Advisor, John Ehrlichman. Nixon hoped that by forcing his closest advisors to give up their positions, he would convince the American people that he held those in his administration who were involved in the crime responsible, and that it might take the presumption of guilt off of him personally. Nixon also announced that he was appointing a new Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and he was authorizing him to appoint a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, who would investigate the Watergate break-in. Nixon hoped that this action might make it appear as though he had nothing to hide, because he was willing to have the matter investigated from within the White House. But Nixon was wrong. May 1973. The Senate convenes a special committee of their own to investigate the Watergate break-in, and they call in administration officials to provide testimony under oath on whether the president was personally involved in the crime.
President Nixon's criminality in the Watergate scandal begins to reveal itself in the Senate subcommittee. June 1973. Former White House counsel John Dean testifies under oath that President Nixon personally planned the cover-up and had authorized the destruction of evidence and the bribing of the accused to keep them quiet. July 1973. White House aide Alexander Butterfield reveals to the Senate subcommittee that Nixon had secretly recorded nearly every conversation he had had in the White House and over the phone. The tapes could prove Nixon's role in the scandal and provide evidence of his guilt. These tapes would become known as the Nixon tapes and would be his undoing. October 1973. Special prosecutor Archibald Cox sues President Nixon, demanding he turn over the White House tapes so that they could be reviewed for evidence. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes and ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. This move made Nixon look like he had something to hide, since he himself authorized the appointment of Cox. Richardson refused to fire Cox and resigned as Attorney General, rather than follow Nixon's unethical order. The Deputy Attorney General, who took over for Richardson, also refused to fire Cox, and he was fired by Nixon. This panic flurry of resignations and firings over the Nixon tapes became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Just days before, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after it came to light that he had accepted illegal bribes. The entire Nixon administration appeared to be corrupted. Agnew was replaced quickly by House Minority Leader Gerald Ford. Disturbed by Nixon's behavior and convinced of adequate evidence of presidential wrongdoing, the House began preparing for impeachment hearings.
The Nixon presidency was quickly coming to a disgraced end. March 1974. A federal grand jury indicts 7 presidential aides on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Perjury is the crime of lying under oath. Spring 1974. Federal investigators demand that President Nixon hand over unedited versions of his secret White House tapes. Nixon refuses, claiming that doing so would jeopardize national security and that his private tapes were protected by executive privilege, or a special protection that Nixon thought the president should have that put him above the law. Nixon had always believed in an imperial presidency, or an idea that the presidency had a special, elevated status in government that made it more powerful than the other branches and gave it an immunity from the law. Even after he left office, he told reporter David Frost,
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
July 24th, 1974. The Supreme Court unanimously rules against Nixon, claiming that the president had no executive privilege to hide potential criminal evidence. They decide that Nixon must release the tapes to investigators. July 27, 1974. The House committee approves 3 articles of impeachment for President Nixon. Impeachment is when a sitting president is put on trial in the Senate after being accused of crimes while in office. If convicted by the Senate, the president is removed from office and could face prison. Nixon was charged with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress for refusing to hand over his tapes. If the House of Representatives voted to impeach Nixon, he would have to stand trial in the Senate.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Disgraced and desperate to hold on to power, Nixon complied with the Supreme Court ruling. The president released his White House tapes, but there were gaps in the audio that had been erased, making it appear that Nixon was intentionally trying to destroy evidence. However, investigators discovered a conversation that provided evidence that Nixon had not only known about the break-in, but he personally approved of the plans to cover up the crime and mislead the FBI. August 8, 1974. With overwhelming evidence of his criminal guilt and hoping to avoid impeachment and an almost certain conviction in the Senate, Richard Nixon announced his intention to resign the presidency.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Nixon never admitted any wrongdoing, even as several of his former advisors were convicted of crimes related to the Watergate break-in.
Noon, August 9, 1974. Nixon becomes the first and only president to date to resign the office of the presidency. His newly appointed vice president, Gerald Ford, was sworn in as the 38th president of the United States. September 8, 1974. In an effort to move the nation past the shame of the Watergate scandal, President Ford addressed the nation from the Oval Office and granted a full presidential pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed against the United States.
And by these presents do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States.
This meant that Nixon would never face jail time for any crimes that connected him to the Watergate burglary. The American people have never really recovered from Watergate, still distrustful of government, A crisis of confidence in national leadership has led to decades of partisan politics, and Richard Nixon's legacy seems to be divided upon those party lines. To conservatives, he was a titan who revolutionized Cold War diplomacy and ushered in a new era of conservative values. To liberals, he was a criminal and the most corrupt man to ever hold the presidency. Regardless of opinion, Nixon's legacy is dominated by Watergate, and it will be forever.